Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this ILC webinar. My name is Paul Goulden, and I'm the Head of Programs and Partnerships here at ILC. And I'm delighted to welcome you to the third event in our series supported by the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries, looking at longevity and the long-term thinking that's needed to meet the challenges and to make the most of the opportunities that these present. So today we're going to be looking at birth rates and longer lives. We've all seen the news stories about low replacement rates, but these do tend to be headlines that are forgotten about the next day, and governments seem to either put them into the too difficult or the not now piles, or take some short-term action that seemingly is without thought of the consequences. So this afternoon, we want to get underneath the headlines and look at both the implications of low replacement rates and longer lives, but also explore what governments at all levels should be doing. And I'm delighted to welcome our four speakers who are bringing their expertise to this session. Firstly, Dr. Dermot Grenham, Council Member at the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries. Professor Stuart Geitel-Baston, Professor in Social Science and Public Policy at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. Reena Biswakarma, PhD Researcher in Global Reproductive Health at the University College London. And finally, David Sinclair, our Chief Executive here at ILC UK. The biographies of all our speakers will be in the chat, and the format of this session will be that I'll ask each of our four panelists to give their thoughts on this topic, and then we will then open the floor up to questions. So please do use the Q&A function to pose your questions to the panel. So without further ado, I'd like to start with Dr. Dermot Grenham. Dermot, can you kick us off, please?
Great, thanks very much, Paul, and good afternoon, or whatever other time you are where you're zooming in from. So looking at the whole issue of low birth rates, low fertility, I thought, first of all, let's just have a think about what that actually means in practice. So people talk about a replacement rate of about 2.1 children per woman, which is the rate that would be required over the long term to keep a population relatively stable, absent immigration. And low fertility compared to that is when fertility rates are significantly below that, such that one would expect, again, absent of immigration, that the population would start declining over the coming decades. So if the replacement rate is 2.1, the rates that we have in the UK are 1.44 across England and Wales, 1.3 here in Scotland where I am, and 1.5 in Northern Ireland. So all those relatively low compared to that replacement rate. And rates across the world in many countries are even lower. South Korea at the moment is 0.7. So again, very low compared to that replacement ratio. And what sort of implications that one can think about this? And I think one can think about implications in two ways, in the sense of what do low birth rates tell us about what's happening in society at the moment? What do they imply, looking in this sense, looking backwards, looking at current society, but also what do they tell us about what's going to be potentially happening in the future as there are fewer babies coming through in a population. And I think if we look at the issue of why are rates low, there's all sorts of economic and sociological reasons for that. And me coming from an actuarial background, tend to focus on some of those economic reasons. But actually, I sometimes find the sociological reasons much more interesting, although much more, you could say, intractable, unless one deals with them, then trying to solve the purely economic aspects of an issue is going to be more difficult. But just looking at, you could say, the numbers, the demographic mathematics of it, having fewer children coming through fewer babies being born, means that what in the past would have been a population pyramid with a wide base and a narrow peak at the top is becoming much more of a column, if not being inverted. And just like trying to balance a pyramid on its tip is going to be very difficult, then potentially, although not necessarily, balancing an economy on fewer workers, fewer children coming through with a higher number proportion of older people will bring new challenges that we've not really faced before. Doesn't mean they're not solvable. And I think, therefore, those people that cry that there's going to be an absolute disaster and that the countries are heading for a demographic car crash, I think are being a bit too extreme. But nonetheless, as Paul mentioned, this is a topic that people tend to sweep under the carpet and don't try to think enough ahead to accept that we're moving into a new environment. and therefore we do need to think carefully about that sort of issues that are going to arise as a result of fewer workers. Interestingly, fewer, excuse me, fewer consumers. One of the solutions put forward is increased AI, increased automation, which can produce the goods potentially and services that we're finding at the moment. But if there aren't consumers in that sort of working age, young age population who consume differently to the older population, then replacing the production capacity may not have the same impact. Lots of challenges, but then aren't there always many challenges? Smaller tax base potentially to support financially the care and pension costs and health costs of the older population. The provision of care, provision of carers for the older population, the emotional support, the provision of essential workers. AI and automation can replace many jobs, perhaps including my own as an actuary, but many jobs, perhaps we're trying to see in the more the trade type jobs. Can AI and automation replace those? And if you quickly look, and I'm sure some of the speakers will cover this in more detail, what can be done? There's two areas, again, that one can look at. One is, if we think we need to have more babies, how do we do that? Or if we say, well, actually, that's a personal decision, we're not going to get involved in that, as many governments don't. We're just going to look at the consequences and see how we can adapt society, prepare society for greater age, people working longer, AI automation, immigration, some of these quite sensitive topics. Getting more babies, incentives of all sorts don't seem to work very well. I personally think we need to look more closely at family policy, family development, robustness, people getting married, staying together, providing that emotional community support, and also avoiding barriers which stop people having the number of babies that they would ideally like. I'll stop there and hand over to the next speaker.
Dermot, thank you so much for that. Stuart, may I hand over to you?
You're on mute.
Of course I am. There's always one, isn't there? Sorry about that. Okay, let's try again. So I was just basically going to be following on from exactly what Dermot said there. That I think when we're looking at this whole issue, there's, I think, a conceptually easy approach or easier response, which is difficult politically, and then a more kind of conceptually challenging one and a kind of unsolved problem. Because in many ways, we can solve this issue in quite a mechanical way. We can say, well, low fertility is a driver of aging and of population growth or of slow growth, and these are problematic in some way in a classical economic framework of kind of lower GDP in richer countries. We talk about the sustainability of pension systems or health or social welfare systems. Increasingly, as this is becoming a kind of middle income issue, about getting old before you get rich, if we can actually develop these systems. And of course, these kind of countries expressing different geopolitical concerns. And I suppose the simple solution is more babies. We need more babies, right? And this is, I think, governments looking for a demographic solution to a demographic problem. But of course, this is not very effective. Firstly, as Dermot pointed out, pro-natalist policies actually do very little to increase the fertility rate. Plus, babies don't actually work. Babies are quite lazy in that regard. So we have to wait for 20 years for these policies to really make much difference, by which time many of the problems will become insurmountable. And of course, the labour market will have completely changed. So in some ways, we would argue it's quite simple to say, well, the best way to fix this in the medium term is through some of the things, again, that Dermot has mentioned, through institutional reform, through technology, through fixing the pension system, through maximising demographic dividend, productivity, human capital, all the wonderful things which ILC are doing in terms of healthy ageing, and so on and so forth. So that's, although that's difficult to do, conceptually, I think that's quite easy. But then does that mean then that we just say, well, then we don't have to worry about low fertility, let's forget about that? And I think in some ways that gives many of us who work on this topic quite a convenient escape clause, because as we know, for many people, all of these kinds of issues we talked about above yes, they talk about concern about the pension system, but these are also wrapped up in this bigger package of things like nationalism and anti-migrant sentiment and rolling back gains in sexual and reproductive health and rolling back gender and women's rights and roles. And of course, we see an explosion of this in the US recently. Plus, another reason why we might not like to talk so much about it is because, frankly, demography, we don't have a very good history when it comes to mobilizing reproduction for one end or another. Whether or not this is through eugenics, whether or not this is through mobilizing reproduction for economic development, so we want to avoid the mistakes that have been made in the past. Plus, and also on the other side, if you're seen to be pro-family or even pro-child, well, this is so embedded within this kind of gender conservative view that this can actually, even if you are not conservative, this can actually end up creating stigma for certain family formations. And so I think in many ways, we've gone a little bit too far towards, oh, well, we'll just fix institutions, forget about fertility. And what we've therefore done is, I think, surrendered too much ground, either to the pro-natalist right in many cases, but I think also through self-censorship to avoid offending others. So again, that goes back, as Dermot said, to go back to low fertility and thinking about, well, why is fertility so low in many places? And why is the reality so different to reproductive aspirations? And in that sense, we look at this issue and we say, well, there's a lot of problems here. There's a crisis in many ways, right? That there are so many challenges towards having children and also to having the life that you want to have in terms of work, family, leisure, and home with an equitable distribution of responsibilities. And actually, this is, I think, too important a problem to ignore and certainly to leave to the pro-natalist right. So, as Dermot said, we definitely can and we should be developing and rolling out better family, labour force, housing and education policies and other policies to support families and enable people to lower the risks associated with starting and growing a family. However, firstly, these policies need to be responsive. We need to listen to what people want and need. And of course, now we have a relatively strong evidence base on the kind of policies which people and women in particular feel would help the most. And these will come as much from the workplace, from the employer and the community, as they will from the government. Secondly, supporting children and families and reproductive aspirations should be an end in its own right, rather than as some kind of tool to meet a target fertility rate. Take assisted reproduction technology, for example. In some places, this is being used and subsidized as a means to increase the fertility rate. No, this should just be an end in itself of democratizing and increasing access to this technology. Thirdly, you can support children and families without stigmatizing those who choose not to have children, right? Which seems to be an impossible idea in many countries in the world at the moment. And then finally, in my last 15 seconds, more broadly, I think this whole issue has to be reframed. Calling this a kind of demographic nightmare, demographic crisis, saying we're going to go extinct just makes everything worse. People are already anxious about a lot of things. We don't need to add this to that. Instead, I think governments and employers should say, well, instead of low fertility being the problem and you have to fix it by increasing your reproductive labour, instead, governments, employers, and so on actually should put their hands up and say, well, actually, this is a system that we created, right? We are responsible for this. Low fertility is not the problem to be fixed. It is a downstream consequence of these broken systems. And so that means supporting, listening, offering choices, and being inclusive in terms of the policies that we develop, which I think is pretty far away from where a lot of people who are talking about fertility rates at the moment currently are. And I mean, if we do all of that, actually, the fertility rates probably will go up in the end, but that is not the reason that we should be doing it.
Dermot, thank you very much for that. Rena, may I come to you now, please?
Thank you so much to both of my speakers before me. So I'm delighted to be here to share my perspective on how reproductive health education can help societies adapt to this sort of lower birth rates that is occurring for a really long time now. So focusing on reproductive health education side of things, across the world and in the UK, reproductive health education sort of still heavily focuses on preventing pregnancies and STIs and contraception, with very little focus actually on fertility awareness. And echoing sort of Stuart and Dermot before me, it's actually that fertility education is not taught to young people, and it's not taught purely because it's not seen as relevant to them. And that's when my team and I did some research to really understand what young people want. And that was, they wanted fertility education to be taught to them for a really young age and for it to be comprehensive. Because what is happening is these young adults are growing up and having no fertility education. And by the time they actually want to conceive, it can be in their early 30s or sort of late 30s. And by that time, they are unaware that their chances are quite slim. And with our study, we found that a lot of people actually desire, adults and young people want to have children in their sort of late 20s, but because of these barriers that sort of Dermot was highlighting before, environmental barriers, so with climate change going on, and social barriers, they want to achieve this sense of stability before they have children. So stability both sort of emotionally, financially, having a house, having a stable partner, as well as accumulating these life experiences before having children. And this sort of, these all factors postpone their parenthood chances, and they don't realize this until they're at a point where they have to conceive through using sort of ARTs, assisted reproductive technologies. But again, they have very little understanding of actually how ART works, and that ART chances are actually quite low the older you get. So this lack of fertility education is having a real gap where people are overestimating how long men and women can postpone having children without having real complications, and that they don't realize how early on egg and sperm quality actually does tend to decline. So this lack of understanding can have significant emotional distress to people, and they have this sense of lost opportunity and added pressure around having a family. And these sort of personal challenges have a broader societal consequences, obviously, with economic pressures of slower labor force growth and increased wealth and pension costs. Sort of adding to that, demographic shifts in demands means that we need to have a sort of clear solution, and that solution is to integrate fertility education within the reproductive health curriculum, which my team and I have been doing in the UK, to make sure that the curricula that is actually being taught in schools is not just limited to not being pregnant, but actually where they do learn about fertility, reproduction, and the realistic information about reproductive technologies, and for it to be inclusive, as so many young people have said that the curriculum that are taught at the moment is very heteronormative and not inclusive of those in LGBTQ plus communities. So really, it isn't about giving people information just so they can have a family, but empowering them with accurate knowledge so they can either make informed decisions to have a family or not to build a family, but they make sure that it isn't something that is pushed on them, but a decision that they want to be able to make and can make. And this is where the government policies come in, where we need comprehensive education to be implemented, to not just let people sort of say, okay, you need to have kids, but actually give them the knowledge for them to be making these sort of comprehensive and very informed decisions about future planning as well. Thank you very much.
Rena, thank you so much for that perspective. And last but by no means least, David, can I come to you for an ILC perspective?
Great, and thank you all for those. And there's a real risk here. I violently agree with everyone. It's probably too late to do very much about birth rates, so particularly in places like Korea, where, as Stuart pointed out, the dependency ratio would increase for about 25 years anyway, if we're looking at it as a demographic problem. And actually, we've also heard that beyond gender equity and family policy, which of course we should do anyway, actually there isn't very much that actually really works. And actually education, as Rena highlighted, is clearly something we really need to do as well. Sarah Harper argues that actually her research on financial incentives shows that it just results in people gaming the system and having more children when they get the incentive, as opposed to them necessarily having more children as a whole. And of course, it's really hard to get people to do things they don't want to do. So in the 1990s, Japan did two things. One, they actively said everyone needs to do 10,000 steps, and they actively said everyone should have more children. Every year since they introduced these two policies, you've seen Japanese people do fewer steps, and you've seen them have fewer children. So actually, government's ability to influence is not particularly strong in this area. So I just want to focus for a couple of minutes on three things, what in relation to the implications of birth rates and what we need to do about it. So firstly, we need to plan for demography. And actually, we're not planning for demography. And that's in the UK and across the world. Secondly, we need to work longer, and actually we're not in the UK, and we're not in lots of places across the world. And thirdly, we need to stay healthy, and again, we aren't. So we know what we need to do in terms of adapting to this demographic change, but we're not doing it. So just to build on those a little bit, what does planning for demography mean? Well, actually, look at different bits in the UK, for example, are going to have a different demography. So, for example, going to need fewer schools, and we've known this for a long time. We've all of a sudden seen schools starting to close in London. In London alone, primary school numbers projected to fall by 52,000 over the next 3 or 4 years. We've got empty school buildings we have no idea what to do with, and this should not have been a surprise. We knew this was coming, and yet at a local level, we have just not planned for these changes in population. Secondly, we need to plan for different forms of housing. Government's got ambitions for house building, but no real sense that their plans are taking account of aging. So government seems to be saying it's up to local government to decide what's needed, but too many local planners have moved from planning for demography to looking for reasons to object to development. So we probably need a bit more yes in my backyard and actually planning for demography for housing. And then secondly, linked into the first, demographic changes aren't equal. So birth rates are lower in London and other bits of the UK, but actually also the median age in coastal communities is higher than in urban areas. There's a lot of older people in coastal communities. It's an issue that Chris Whitty has got extremely interested in, because basically we don't have enough young people who want to work in health in coastal communities in the UK, and we don't have the right services. So people are moving to coastal communities where there are no stroke services, and you need them immediately. So there is a thing about planning, and Professor Mayhew and I did a piece of work. Well, it was just a blog a couple of years ago where we looked at the sort of whole obsession with creating different generational names from Gen X to Gen Y and Gen Z and things like that. And of course, originally these sort of generational names were the difference between the high point and the low point of a demographic boom and bust. And now they're being designed by marketing people who've decided that, and actually there isn't a demographic connection between high and low between millennials and Gen X and Gen Z and so on. So I think we just need to think a bit more about that. Secondly, working longer. 1.6 million people between 50 and state pension age who aren't working in the UK due to health or care reasons. The one economic lever government has got to drive growth is the workforce. So we're missing a huge opportunity here. We need a bit of carrot, the right sort of incentives. Yes, flexibility in work, but also investing in care, childcare, and indeed care of older people. But we probably also need a bit of stick. We need to be honest with people that they're likely to have to work longer, and we are likely to need to increase the state pension age, which probably will have an impact on the length on which people work. It's worth saying purpose is really important into any way. And actually, we're not necessarily talking about people working to 70, but actually it's about as much about more work between the age of 18 and state pension age, where we actually work less than ever before. Our Healthy Aging and Prevention Index and some of our UK work shows we're working 6 months less in the UK than we did before the pandemic. So 31.6 years down to 31.1 years. So we're working less and working more part-time at a time we need to be doing more. And then the third point is stay healthy. And I won't rehearse our arguments about the evidence for prevention, but if we need us to be active, whether that be through work or other activities for longer, we need to be healthier. And yet there is some evidence from UCL that future generations coming up in the UK are in worse health than current generations at the same age. What are healthy aging? I think there's 3 things we can do. One is essentially clearly invest in preventative health services like vaccination, the new obesity medication, making sure these are accessible to all, making sure we have the right sort of levels of uptake. We need to ensure that with, for example, the new obesity medication, that it isn't about individual health, but about population health. And at the moment, they're far too expensive to drive population health, but they are potentially improving individual health. Secondly, we need a bit of nanny state on steroids. We need to be regulating some of those things that are bad for us, including some ultra-processed food. And the third one, which actually is probably the hardest, we need to be getting people out of the cars, restricting our free car parking, making active travel a social norm. We're not, and until we do that, investing in prevention, dealing with some of the things that are bad for us and getting us to physical activity, we're not going to be healthy enough to tackle this challenge. So final thing just to say is ILC in the UK, we're building a UK long lives index on a similar basis to which we have built our global index. And what we hope this may do is help us understand, for example, the relationship between the environment, health, life expectancy, employment, and wealth. And typically and traditionally, as we get richer and more educated, I'm very much generalizing, we've had fewer children. There has, over the last few years, been some interesting research that suggested at a local level in the UK, this isn't always the case, and that there are some local areas where actually we're giving people, the right sort of, where essentially it's nice places for people to bring up children, where actually we may not be seeing the same pattern. So I do hope our UK Long Lives Index will help us understand what makes a community that could drive higher rates of people having children who want to. Okay, thanks. Thank you, everyone.
David, thank you, and thank you to our panelists as well. So we'll kick off now with the question and answer session. Thank you to those who have put questions in the chat. I'm going to start, if I may, with a sort of a question I think sort of stands before some of the comments that have been made and is reflected in one of the questions. Do those low fertility rates actually matter? So David Attenborough himself has come out and said that actually lower population figures across the globe would actually help the fight against climate change. And it does seem that we almost have a presumption here that low fertility rates and low replacement rates are bad and we should be growing. But I mean, can we just challenge that to start with? So could I ask maybe Dermot to kick off in, how important is this? Should we be fearful of a far smaller global or nation population?
I don't think we should be fearful, as I think Stuart mentioned. Don't want to be fear-mongering among people. I think we have to just accept, if we want to accept lower fertility rates and not put any effort into trying deliberately to increase them without forcing people, then we just have to take the consequences, as David was talking about, planning for demography. I don't think personally that there's necessarily a conflict between having more people or the same number of people and climate change, because for me, it comes down to consumption. So if people could have no children but could be consuming much more as a consequence, or a family with 4 children could be producing as much CO2 as a family with 1 or no children. So I don't think it comes down necessarily to a numbers game. And also, the world has always been a tough place. It's always been challenging to that question about why bring another child into the world. Today, it's because of climate change. Other periods of history, it would have been for other reasons. So I don't think we need to be fearful. I think we just need to accept that whatever level of fertility we've got, there are going to be challenges of one sort or another. And we just have to be geared up for whichever one we decide to go down. And different countries will have different challenges within that. But finally, if South Korea continues, though, with its very low fertility rate, the population will eventually disappear. Mathematically, I doubt we would actually ever get there. And I think I would be very upset if we had no more South Koreans on the planet.
Thank you. Rena, any comments on this?
So from my perspective, with the research that we have done, climate change tends to be a common thing that people have noted, and it is a reason for them not to pursue having children because of the unstable climate, with financial, how cost of living crisis is going. However, it's about giving people a choice to have children in the future rather than being childless by situation. So giving people enough information that they can make informed decisions about whether to become parents or not become parents, rather than this figure that they have to have a certain level of children. So it's not about installing that fear in them, but actually giving them the choice to be able to make those informed decisions about being parents in the future from a reproductive health perspective.
Thank you. Stuart?
Yeah, well, I think just on what Dermot said there, I think about going extinct. You see, I think we're going to go extinct for a lot of other reasons before the birth rate. Right? This is going to be, you know, like killer robots or nuclear war or climate crisis, right? That's what's going to finish us, right? It's not the birth rate, right? It certainly over the next couple of 100 years. I mean, I think that question of does fertility matter? I mean, as a demographer, I would say, well, you know, of course, it depends how low is low, right? Because we obsess over replacement, we obsess over 2.1, which is kind of bizarre in many ways, because it assumes that whatever the population figure is at this particular time, that's what it's meant to be forever, right? That's the perfect, like the optimum population. And there is no such thing as an optimum population size. For those of us might remember the optimum population trust, right? Which is now population matters, right? But this idea of an optimum population, isn't quite right. If you have a fertility rate of 1.7, 1.8, and plus immigration, plus high levels of human capital of health and education, well, actually, you can see your per capita GDP go up, right? That's a good thing, yeah, with like slow growth. Now, as we say, if you go down to 1 or 0.6, 0.7, as we see in my part of the world here, and this happens in a very short period of time, then that does cause problems. That gives Dermot headaches, right? Because it does cause problems for the sustainability of the systems that we have. We can't pretend that doesn't exist. So fertility in that sense really does matter. But I go back to what I was saying before. I think it matters more to say, but then why is fertility 0.7 in Korea? Why is fertility 1.0, 1.1 in Thailand, in China? Why is it 1.3 in Scotland? When it doesn't seem that that's really what people want. I think that's where I think fertility rates really matter, is that they are it's a lens to look through and to see what those challenges are. And in the same way is, why is fertility very high in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, right, and other parts of and parts of Asia? It's not a problem in itself. It's a reflection of like what's going on, right? Why can't we break those problems which are leading to these very high fertility rates, which are not what people want either, not what women want either, in many cases.
Thank you, Stuart. David, anything to add on this?
I suppose only one thing to build on this, and I'd also be very sad if we lost all the Koreans. It's an amazing place, a really interesting thing about Korea, and I was there last summer, and talking to people in the workforce, is that clearly in Korea, one of the things that we need to address is misogyny in the culture, society as a whole, and particularly within the workforce. And I was talking to a couple of women saying, you know what, we'd prefer to play golf. And within Korea, what you saw was the 4B movement grew out of Korea, and this was and this went viral again after Trump won last year. But essentially, this is a radical feminist movement that saw some women refusing to marry, have children, engage in romance, or participate in sexual relationships with men. And one of the drivers is actually the workplace isn't great for women. It's really hard to get back into work. If we could address some of that misogyny and drive gender equity, that is worth us doing anyway, and may well have the really positive impact of actually sort of changing the approach to children, people's attitudes towards them. But it's certainly a very significant challenge in Korea is the gender inequity.
Thank you, Dave. Thank you. So I'd like to sort of combine a couple of the questions that are in the Q&A now around ageism and also the workforce. So we have a question about low replaceability rates leading to greater value of older workers. And then also a question about the idea of work. One of the issues around working longer is actually employer ageism. So from the panel, I mean, how, yes, if the low replaceability rates are going to continue, is that a way that we are going to value older people a bit more and tackle, you know, is that workforce issue not going to be an issue because we'll all be living longer to have that to feed into that labour force? Maybe Stuart, could I come to you first on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think, we've actually done quite a lot of modelling of this, and increasing labour force participation at all ages, and increasing productivity within that labour force participation, so maximising the potential there, is always a better response to population aging, to slow the demographic measures of population aging, than having a higher fertility rate. So this is definitely the case. I think that as time goes on, you know, I mean, in the 20th century, it was like there was unlimited people, right? People were not a scarce resource, right? The labor was cheap, people everywhere, and I think employers could afford to be kind of picky. Employers could afford to discriminate more. Employers could afford to be ageist. I think we're moving in a direction where that's not necessarily going to be the case for much longer in many parts of the world, unless, of course, AI technology goes faster than those and replaces jobs and replaces decent employment faster than this demographic change occurs. So, I mean, my hope is that it just by supply and demand, right, that it forces people to rethink their attitudes about age and ageism. But on the other hand, if we still carry on in this kind of frightening existential crisis narrative, that is ironically, I think, going to makes things worse for ageism, right? That it can push this ageist narrative. And the way we talk about it in terms of dependency as well doesn't help either. So I think, you know, it should get better, but I don't know whether it will.
Shall I come in, Paul?
David,
on that? Just
yeah.
respond to that. I think a slightly different approach to it as well. I think the market will drive an increase because companies are going to need workers, and we have seen that. But actually, more broadly, we need a demand and a supply approach to older workers. So, and actually, we need, you know, on the demand side, we need this to, you know, it is somewhat sad that and I see we've got Kay Allen on the line, who was very heavily involved in B&Q and the work they did around older workers. This is now 35, 40 years ago. This is the 1990s. That we are still using B&Q and Ford, and examples that are 30 years old is frankly a disaster in this space. And we need more employers to be stepping up. But we do also need to, when I say demand and supply, you need to be looking at the supply side issues. So barriers such as ageism, but not just ageism, into how you support people to work longer. But demand side is something that's underplayed. We're about to have a industrial strategy and a spending review. How can we need to make sure that within our industrial strategy we are creating the sort of jobs that people want to do, of our and our demography wants to do, and we have the right skills to do. So there is no point in us creating an industrial strategy that is about creating jobs that frankly we don't have the population mix to drive. So how do we think about what is our industrial strategy in terms of building our care sector and building certain sectors where we really need a workforce and where we may have potential workers to deliver that. So I think, you know, we get very focused on the supply side, and you know, is it about older workers or approaches of companies? But there is a broader government approach around this sort of macro approach to demand in the economy, which we also need to address with an aging population.
Thank you, David. Rena, on this on this question about the workforce, anything from you?
No, I don't have anything to add on that.
Okay, thank you. Dermot?
Yeah, a few things actually I'd like to throw in here. And I think linked to David's points about working longer, staying healthy, is, are we educating young people now for a much longer working life, much more, you could say, volatile or changeable working life, so that actually they are able to reskill, retrain? Are we educating them to deal with AI and automation? Because if they're being trained in the same way as they were 10, 20 years ago, that's not going to set them up with the skills they need now, let alone in 50 years' time when they're in their 50s and 60s. I think also when we talk about, and I've not done much work in this area, Stuart and David will know more about this, when we look at that age group of 50 to 65 or 50 to 70, although they may not be in the employed workforce, I don't know what proportion of them are spending all their time on the golf course rather than working. But I think my experience, which is only anecdotal, is that a lot of them are working in terms of they're providing childcare to grandchildren, possibly at the same time looking after parents, so actually caring for people of an older age. They might also be working in the charity sector, non-executives on boards at a certain level, doing all sorts of things. So, you know, of some certain old people wondered how they ever managed to do that job given how busy they are once they've retired. So I think that needs to be, so if we got them back into the workforce by carrot or stick, who will then do the jobs that they're currently doing? So I think we just need to think through some of those things. And yes, certainly as regards the indigenous population, low fertility means that there are fewer of them, but there's still a lot of a big pool of people in Africa, and will continue to be so. Some people have said that the low fertility rates and aging populations in Western and other countries could be, you know, the making of Africa, if they're able to provide the workers and so on for those countries. How that pans out, I've got no idea, but it's certainly an option again. And therefore thinking ahead, both from our side of the fence and from the African side of the fence, I think might be one of the part of the solutions to some of the challenges we're facing.
Dermot, thank you so much for that. So for the next question, just picking up on the theme from some of the panelists, but also questions on barriers. And also I'm going to use chair's privilege here. I'm involved in a small charity called Aging Without Children, and there's a Robin Hadley who's put some questions in. And if it's the same one, Robin has written extensively on male childlessness. So people aging without children tends to be coming into two categories. So either choice or lack of choice, or around circumstance. And I wonder whether the panel, with some of the things that you've touched on around those barriers and giving people more choice, so talking about this as a societal issue rather than a demographic manipulation issue, where are the key areas that the panel would see that might give people more, not necessarily get people to have more babies, because that what we're actually after, but give them more of a put them in more of a position to make that choice should they so desire it. Dermot, I'm going to come straight back to you, if I may.
Right. Well, I think your final comment there, Paul, is interesting. If they should so desire it, I think one thing is, how does one change the culture so that people might desire to have more children? What is it? Why do people have children? There was a book by a couple of American academics called "What Are Children For?" And it's actually challenging the ideas, because if I look back to previous generations, it's not quite as simple as this, but women, couples had children. There wasn't really any discussion, really. Maybe a bit discussion about the number, but not whether they had some or not. And whereas now it's one choice among others. And obviously recognizing that infertility is a key issue as well, that we shouldn't forget that some people end up being childless again, because they just happen to be infertile, which is, can be quite a challenge for them. So I think it's thinking about what is it that makes couples want to have children. And I don't think it should be because they're going to pay their pension necessarily. It's broadening it out to because they want to bring people into the world and raise them up to be flourishing adults. So I think trying to get that across, that it's not just numbers, it's not just about putting people into the workforce or paying pensions. There's, I think it was Stuart's comments about that it's an end in themselves, not a means or not a tool for something else. And I think male child is an interesting topic. I was thinking as you were saying that, Paul, that when you have more children, you could have the maiden aunt or the maiden uncle, who actually within the family context provided such support to grandchildren, nephews, nieces, that as they got older, they were also supported in turn by the family. As families now are perhaps smaller, perhaps more fragmented, that is actually going to become more challenging. Those individuals who are don't have that family support, how they will thrive and survive as they get older. So I think, again, another almost sociological challenge coming out of all of this.
Thank you. Rena.
Yep, so sort of echoing what Dermot has said with the barriers, there's actually quite a lot of barriers that stop people from having children. Their actual intentions to have children is quite early on than when they do have children, because barriers such as they want to buy a house, they want to go traveling, they want to be stable financially to provide for their kids, and they want to be mature within themselves. So by the time they actually have all these things that they desired for, they're sort of missing the boat. And a lot of attention is given to women, right? So a lot of education is given to women, and that ticking biological time clock is always emphasized on the women, whereas men are not really given that opportunity to discuss these things and to have that sort of education on it. And men actually desire to have children as much as women do, research has found, but actually there's such an emphasis on women having children that men are sort of forgotten about in this equation. So these barriers, if governmentally and the cost of living, people can save up more, they can do a lot of these things sooner. Actually, people would want to have kids sooner as well. And also doing research on ethnic minority communities is really important, because that question, why do we want children? It's different for men and women from different cultures, because actually when you ask people, why do you want to have children in ethnic communities? They don't actually know, because they have never been questioned about it. Well, they go, well, I don't know, it's because of my religion, or it's because I come from a big family. Whereas when you ask people from Caucasian backgrounds, they know exactly why they want to have children. They want to pass on what they've learned from their dad, and they want to spend time with children. So it's actually really important to see having children, family building through different ethnic minority communities and different communities as well. So it's just such a broad topic that needs to be divided into small sections to be effectively know actually what are these barriers and how can we make sure these barriers are what's the word I'm looking for, these barriers, we can actually address it properly as well. Yeah, knock it down.
Thank you, Rena. Thank you. David.
Yeah, just I and I'm going to probably ignore your question and answer something slightly different. I think one of the things I think that we just need to reflect on is, of course, high fertility isn't in the interests of many women and families. And of course, high fertility is often related to high childhood and indeed maternal mortality as well. Um, and of course, we could look to areas which have high, as we've touched on, which have high rates of high rates of fertility or children. But that an interesting one, of course, is in both Israel. Israel is the outlier in the OECD with relatively high rates of fertility, but Palestine also has relatively high rates of fertility. Influenced very heavily in both cases by cultural, religious, and socioeconomic factors. So clearly there are, Israel is an OECD wealthy country and has relatively high birth rates. So how much is the challenge around sort of religion and faith how much is that a driver? I think the one thing that we haven't really talked about, which is links into the question around fertility, is there are some very interesting and innovative fertility treatments currently being developed, which over the next 10, 20 years, you might see very significant changes. And I would encourage you to have a look at some of the work that the Nuffield Council on Bioethics have done, for example, on some of these fertility treatments. So we've just before Christmas, we saw stem cells being used to help an embryo mature outside the body, which led to the people to the first sort of child to come from that route. But actually, there is a potential that some of these new innovations will make it possible for us to have more children. The question is then, again, links into the point you've already said, is how many do we want to have? What's the ideal? So if you don't have the fact that, particularly for women, as every year you get older, it becomes much harder. If you remove that barrier, what does that mean? And I think there's a really in terms of how many children we want and we should be having as a society. And I don't think we're thinking about that enough.
Thanks, David. Thank you. I'd like to delve into this question about culture and class that was mentioned on one of the questions as well, because clearly not only within the UK but globally there will be within countries those different areas, different concentrations of different, not only people from different ethnic backgrounds but also different socioeconomic groups as well. And I think one of the things that ILC certainly what we want to do with our UK index is maybe delve into that a bit more. Do the panel have any reflections on those ethnic differences? I know, Rena, you've touched on this. It would be nice for you to expand as well on how not only what they look like, but also how we might address them, if at all we actually should be addressing them. Rena, you sort of opened this up with some of your comments. May I come to you first?
Yep. So some research that I've done on men. Just a simple, why do you want to have children was asked, and religion, just as David said, is actually religion plays a huge part on people's family building intentions. Is actually Islam promotes people to have more children, so that is a big factor. However, in turn, when people are delaying having children and they want to have sort of a lot more kids than what they can have, that becomes a problem. So in terms of research, ethnic minority communities need to be investigated to actually see what are their family building intentions and are they meeting those intentions, and what is the outcome of not meeting those, and when can and how can that be given to them, because a lot of these communities may not understand English, and how is it that reproductive health and topics around sex and reproductive health, how can that be given to them, because it's so taboo in so many cultures to be able to speak so openly about it as well. So unfortunately, it is a very under-researched area, and there's so many communities that still we don't know what their family building intentions are. But culture and religion plays a huge factor in that, and building education in countries molded around social norms and cultural norms is very, very important.
Thank you for that. Stuart, any reflections from you?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to talk so much about, I think you know about the ethnic minority situation in Britain and Europe better than I do. I think, though, one thing we have to do is be extremely careful when we're talking about these issues, because this is like fire to the flame of our, I was going to say friends or brothers or whatever you want to, it's almost always brothers on the far right who can weaponize this. And of course, this is as old as the hills, right? This is something that's not new, right? This has been going hundreds of years, right? That whether or not it's the poor are having too many children, people here are having too many children, people who look like that are having too many children, people who look like us aren't having enough children. And don't forget, when Mr. Musk and his gang are saying this is the end of civilization, this is not the end of all civilization. This is the end of their kind of civilization that they want, right? So I think we've got to be really careful when we're talking about this and recognize that there is a difference between religious praxis and religious practice, right? There is a difference in theory and practice. And of course, really tackling stereotypes, particularly when we look at Indonesia, the largest Islamic country, and of course has a fertility rate of 2.1, right? But then, when we look at places like Indonesia or Vietnam or other places where we see quite a wide range of fertility rates, again, I go back to saying, yes, we should be concerned about these higher rates because they reflect something else, right? Why is it that in certain provinces or among certain groups of people, fertility is much higher? When we speak to those people, they don't necessarily want it to be that high. Is it a reflection of certain kinds of, a lack of opportunity? Is it a reflection of an unmet need for access to better sexual and reproductive health? Right? I think that's, again, what we need to do is to kind of tone down this whole discussion of differentials in fertility, let's call it that, and actually use that as a lens to look at, well, what is the why is fertility, why are these fertility differentials the way they are? Why do we exist? And how do we throw them away, to use my, how do we get rid of those barriers to meeting these reproductive aspirations, which people say that they want to have?
Thank you so much for that. Dermot.
Yeah, just to throw in is this question that Stuart's referred to and others, that pronatalism often seems to be aligned to the right and the Conservatives, although the Social Market Foundation, which I think is a fairly middle of the road think tank, put out a paper fairly recently saying that it actually is just as much a progressive topic as a right-wing topic, to use those sorts of terms. And I think Stuart's right that we need to remove the barriers to enable men and women to have the number of children they want. And if that's 8 or 10, great. If it's none, great. And we support them, everyone finding their way to contribute to society. And I think some of these policies, it's actually not trying to implement new policies, it's just removing barriers to allow the men and women to decide with, as Rena was saying, the education in advance. They know the sort of things they need to know in advance, the fertility curve and those sorts of things that would be very helpful for our young people to know about.
Thank you. And finally, David.
I think I'll pass. Actually, I don't think I've got anything to add from my colleagues.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, we have just about come to the end of our webinar. So just some final thoughts from me. There seems to be 3 sort of themes and sections that were sort of coming through. So I think the setting the scene bit about that importance of education, the importance that we know why we want to look at fertility rates. We know, a bit more about what the implications are. The very complex picture about all the levers that can be pulled and can have an impact on this. So it is not just a question of the numbers, but it is around housing, it is around workforce, it is around economic contribution, and it is around choice. So looking at those barriers, and I did like Dermot's phrase there about I think paraphrasing him, it's not about mandating or dictating or making policy changes. It's about removing those barriers so that people can make those choices themselves, which I think was a fantastic contribution. And then finally, echoing the whole theme of the work we've been doing with the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries, this whole long-term view and thinking about the issues that what's happening now is going to have 5, 10, 20, 25, 50 years times worth of implication. So it just remains for me to thank our panelists, Stuart, Dermot, Rena, and David, for a fascinating discussion. Thank you to everyone who's attended and put questions in the Q&A. I hope we got to as many of them as we could. And thank you all very much for your contributions. We will be following this up with various ILC activities, but in the meantime, thank you so much for attending this afternoon, and I hope you have a very pleasant rest of your day, or indeed evening, Stuart. But thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.